welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Glad to be here for this.
I am so glad you could join us for this deep dive. We are getting into some really heavy material today. I want you to think about a master chef.
Oh, okay, like a high-end Michelin star situation.
Yeah, precisely. A chef who has spent hours, maybe even days, sourcing the finest ingredients. They have roasted the bones, they reduced the stocks, and they perfectly seasoned this massive pot of expensive, pristine soup.
So a lot of time and money went into this.
Right. The aroma fills the entire kitchen. It is an absolute masterpiece of culinary skill. But then someone walks by and drops a single bead of dish soap right into the center of the pot.
Oh, man. That is brutal.
It is ruined in a fraction of a second. The entire batch is destroyed. A tiny, almost imperceptible fraction of an ounce of contaminant just ruins gallons of perfection.
Because you cannot just scoop it out.
No, you cannot dilute it either. The chemistry of the pot has changed for good. And that precise, devastating ratio is what we are looking at today as we dissect the 10th chapter of Ecclesiastes.
Yeah, looking at the stark contrast between wisdom and folly in a very fleeting, vaporous life.
Spot on. We have two source texts guiding our discussion today, which are the Perfumer's Peril and Wisdom Under the Sun. Our goal is to bring you the historical and theological weight of this text.
And to really grasp what is happening here, we have to look at the author, Koheleth, who is historically understood by the church as King Solomon.
Right, and you probably know the basics of Solomon's reign. He was a man who possessed unparalleled wisdom, given directly by God.
He ruled during this golden age of peace and wealth in Israel.
But, his later years were just an absolute disaster. He succumbed to catastrophic folly.
He did, multiplying foreign wives, turning his heart toward idolatry, and setting the stage for a violently divided kingdom.
So when we read Ecclesiastes, we are not reading abstract philosophy from some detached academic. We are reading an urgent, agonizing reflection on human limits under the sun.
Written by a man who lived the very destruction he is warning us about.
Yeah. So let us jump right into the most arresting image from the text, which is found in verse 1. We see this striking picture of the perfumer and the flies.
Right.
Is Solomon's imagery basically describing that ruined pot of soup we talked about?
The analogy of the ruined soup is spot on, but the imagery Solomon uses carries an even more visceral, physical repulsion in the ancient world.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, the Hebrew phrase used in verse 1 is zebubo mawet. That translates literally to flies of death.
Wow, flies of death.
Yeah, it is aggressive. We are looking at a scenario where these dead insects drop into the shimen rokash, which is the perfumer's oil.
And that oil was not cheap.
Right, not at all. In the ancient Near East, creating this perfumed oil was a very laborious, highly skilled craft. The perfumer or the apothecary would crush specific, very expensive spices.
Like what kind of spices?
Things like myrrh, cinnamon, and cassia. They would heat them and carefully extract their fragrance into an olive oil base. It was costly and highly valued.
Right, used in royal or priestly contexts, I imagine.
Exactly. So when these flies of death drop into the vat, they do not just sit on the surface. They drown, they sink, and they begin to ferment.
Oof, that is a terrible image.
It gets worse. The verb Solomon uses indicates a literal putrefaction. The decaying insects cause the oil to bubble, fester, and emit a physical stench.
So it is actively offensive to the senses.
Very much so. Furthermore, in the Levitical context of ancient Israel, a dead insect carries the weight of ritual impurity.
Oh, wow. I had not thought of that. So the oil is ruined chemically, aesthetically, and ritually.
Yeah. Solomon takes this repulsive physical reality and applies it directly to human character.
How so?
Well, a person might spend decades building a faithful life, developing a character that is a sweet fragrance to their family, their community, and the church.
Right.
Yet, one unguarded moment, a sudden loss of temper, a hidden addiction, or a capitulation to lust acts like that dead fly.
And it ferments?
It ferments. It makes the whole life stink. The sources draw out a massive theological implication here regarding human nature.
What do they assert?
They assert the biblical doctrine of human depravity. Sin acts as a virulent, aggressive contaminant. A little folly outweighs wisdom and honor.
That completely refutes the popular notion that human beings can just balance out their bad deeds with good deeds.
Right.
Like on some sort of cosmic scale.
Yeah, sin does not sit neatly on a scale like a static weight. It infects and ruins the whole batch. It takes far less to destroy a reputation than it takes to build one.
That shifts the perspective entirely.
Right.
We tend to think of character as a bank account, where deposits and withdrawals can balance out.
Right, like if I make a mistake, I can just make a deposit of good behavior tomorrow.
But Solomon is telling us character is more like chemistry. Once the contaminant is in, the chemical makeup changes completely. You cannot unferment the oil.
You really cannot.
So that outward ruin, the spoiled perfume, forces us to look at the inward root cause. We cannot just look at the flies. We have to look at the vat they're falling into. Yeah. The text moves from the outward action to the human heart in verses 2 and 3. Solomon writes that the wise man's heart inclines to the right, and the fool's heart inclines to the left.
Yes.
I have to ask about the literal interpretation here. Is Solomon giving us an ancient superstition about left-handedness and right-handedness?
No, not at all.
What is the actual significance of these directions, then? It seems strange to read a geographical or directional map into the anatomy of the human soul.
It is not a superstition about physical handedness, though it is easy to see how modern readers might make that jump. To grasp this, we must clarify the ancient Near Eastern definition of the heart, which is the Hebrew word leb.
Lebs. Okay.
In our modern Western context, we associate the heart almost exclusively with romance, fleeting feelings, and sentimentality.
Yeah, we contrast the heart with the head.
But in biblical anthropology, the leb is the absolute command center of the human person. It encompasses the intellect, the human will, and moral reasoning. It is the seat of decision-making.
Oh, interesting. So it is much more cognitive.
Very much so. When Solomon speaks of the heart inclining, he is talking about the fundamental driving orientation of the soul.
So what about the directions?
The directions of right and left are heavily weighted theological markers in biblical geography. The right hand, Yamin, is consistently recognized in Scripture as the place of strength, covenantal blessing, and salvation.
Okay, and the left?
The left hand, Samal, represents the place of rejection, weakness, and judgment. Think of the sheep and the goats in the New Testament, divided to the right and to the left.
So when Solomon says the fool's heart inclines to the left, he means the fool's internal compass is desperately miscalibrated.
Yes, his intellect and will are bent toward destruction. The sources note that this miscalibration is so severe that a fool cannot even walk down a physical road without advertising his lack of sense to everyone.
Because his choices, his reactions, and his daily habits just leak out.
Yeah, revealing the emptiness inside. The authors of our sources draw a strict theological binary here.
What kind of binary?
They argue that people are either in Adam, meaning their fundamental nature is inclined to the left, or they are in Christ, meaning their nature has been regenerated and inclined to the right.
Okay, and we need to pause here for a second for you listening. We are impartially reporting the author's theological critique right now.
Yes, we are not endorsing either side of the political or theological spectrum here. We are just stating what is in the text.
Right. We want to be clear that we are just bringing you the author's arguments neutrally.
Absolutely. So the authors explicitly contrast this stark biblical binary against progressive or liberal theology. In their view, modern liberal theology promotes moral relativism and subjective truths,
suggesting that the compass can point wherever a person feels is best for them.
Yeah. The sources argue that this kind of theological framework institutionalizes the fool's leftward inclination.
So we are recording their specific critique here to show how the authors apply Solomon's ancient directional metaphor to draw an absolute, unyielding line in the sand regarding human nature and modern theological debate.
That is correct.
Well, that makes perfect sense of the text, and it is a fascinating way the sources apply it to modern theological conversations. If the internal compass is structurally broken, every step the person takes will be in the wrong direction.
Even if they sincerely believe they are walking straight.
Yeah, the sincerity of the fool does not fix the broken compass. So if the heart dictates the person, we must ask what happens when these foolish, left-inclined hearts acquire public authority and political control.
That brings us to verses 4 through 7 and 16 through 17, which deal with rulers and society.
Let me use an analogy regarding authority. Imagine you are on a flight, cruising at 30,000 feet, and you suddenly hit severe, violent turbulence.
Oh, I hate that feeling.
Right. The plane is dropping, luggage is rattling, and panic is setting in. The impulse might be to unbuckle your seatbelt, stand up, march to the cockpit, and yell at the pilot to fix the weather.
Which would be a terrible idea.
It would. Doing so only creates chaos in the cabin, distracts the crew, and puts you at physical risk. Remaining buckled in your seat, staying calm, and waiting out the storm is the only prudent action.
That is a great analogy.
So how does that map onto the text's advice on dealing with angry rulers and the societal disorder Solomon is describing?
Your turbulence analogy captures the exact tension Solomon addresses in verse 4, where he commands, Do not leave your place when the ruler spirit rises against you.
Do not leave your place.
We have to understand the historical reality of the ancient Near East. A king's anger was not just a political inconvenience or a bad news cycle. It meant literal, immediate danger to a person's livelihood or their very life.
Because kings had absolute unchecked authority.
Yeah. The temptation when faced with an unjust or raging ruler is to panic, resign your post in a huff, or retaliate with explosive anger.
Just like run into the cockpit during turbulence.
Right, but Solomon says that calmness pacifies great offenses. Remaining buckled in your seat, to use your analogy, is not an act of cowardice. It is not enabling injustice.
What is it then?
It is a display of steadiness under providence. It shows a resolute trust that God rules over the king and that abandoning your post in a moment of panic only multiplies the damage.
That requires a lot of trust.
It does. Solomon then moves to describe a terrifying societal inversion. He talks about a reality where fools are placed in high positions and princes walk on the ground like servants.
So the society turned completely upside down.
Yes. He acknowledges that public life can become entirely inverted, where the unqualified are exalted and the noble are degraded.
Do the sources talk about how this applies today?
They do. The authors of our sources critique modern society's handling of such foolishness at the institutional level. They claim that the secular world frequently coddles the fool.
In what way?
The sources argue that modern society offers psychological excuses or utilizes sociological frameworks to explain away what the authors define as personal rebellion against God.
Do they name specific frameworks?
Yes, they specifically name critical race theory.
Okay, and again, I want to step in here and reiterate our neutral observational stance for you listening. We are presenting this strictly as the author's argument against secular frameworks.
Right, we are just imparting the material found in the sources.
Spot on. So the authors present this as a direct challenge to secular frameworks that, in their view, remove individual moral agency and blame systemic structures instead.
That is their position, yes. Returning to the biblical text, Solomon contrasts childish rulers who feast in the morning for drunkenness with noble rulers who feast at the proper time for strength.
So what is the difference there?
The childish ruler is governed entirely by his appetite. He uses his authority to consume the nation's resources for his own pleasure, neglecting his duties. And that brings a severe curse upon the land.
And the noble ruler?
The noble ruler exercises self-control, eating only to gain the strength required to fulfill his duty, bringing a blessing to the land. Leadership, in Solomon's eyes, is a moral and spiritual issue before it is ever a managerial or political one.
That distinction between the childish ruler and the noble ruler is really striking.
It is.
The childish ruler views the kingdom as a buffet designed for his consumption, while the noble ruler views his own strength as a tool to sustain the kingdom.
Yeah, that is a great way to put it.
It is fascinating how the text scales from the private heart to the throne room, showing that the lack of self-control is disastrous at every level of human existence.
It ruins everything it touches.
But Solomon does not stay in the high courts of kings. He transitions down to the dirt, the quarry, and the daily grind of ordinary labor in verses 8 through 11 and 18 through 19.
Yes, moving to the physical work of the hands.
Now, I want to push back on the text's examples here for a moment. Solomon talks about digging a pit and falling into it, or breaking a wall and having a snake bite you.
Right.
I read that and think, doesn't that just sound like random bad luck? Or maybe workplace hazards. If I am tearing down a wall and a snake is sleeping in the bricks, that is not a moral failure. That is just biology and bad timing.
It does seem that way at first glance.
How is this a moral or spiritual issue? It feels like we are reading an ancient manual for occupational safety rather than rigorous theological instruction.
Well, it is incredibly easy to misread these verses as simple fatalism or bad luck, but the Hebrew grammar reveals a deliberate theology of work and preparation.
Oh, real? Tell me about the grammar.
Solomon uses a specific sequence of Hebrew participles to describe these actions. He uses chopher for the one digging, messiah for the one quarrying stones, and bokeah for the one splitting logs.
Okay, so very active words.
Very active. He is describing ongoing, strenuous human labor. The central metaphor that ties these dangers together is the concept of the blunt iron, the barzil.
The blunt iron, what does that signify?
If a worker is splitting wood and his axe head is blunt and he refuses to stop and sharpen the edge, he must use far more physical strength to accomplish the exact same task. He expends exhausting, needless energy.
Oh, I see. So the failure to sharpen the axe is not bad luck.
Exactly. It is a failure of wisdom. It is a refusal to recognize the physical limits of the material world. The same principle applies to the snake charmer analogy he uses.
I'll say.
If the serpent bites before it is charmed, the skill of the charmer is entirely useless. The charmer failed to recognize the urgency of timing and preparation.
Ah, so it is about being prepared and aware.
Yes. Solomon is connecting all of this to a severe warning against sloth, famously illustrating a sagging roof and a leaking house caused by lazy hands.
So it is not just random bad luck.
No. The sources argue vigorously against fatalism, which says, well, whatever happens, happens. And they argue against the tendency within some Christian circles to spiritualize poor planning.
That is a great point, spiritualizing poor planning.
Yeah. In a fallen world, physical laws exist and human limits exist. Preparation, counting the cost, maintaining your tools, and executing with diligence are not secular concepts. They are moral duties mandated by the Creator.
So failing to prepare is actually practical denial of the reality God has structured.
Precisely. A believer cannot use faith as an excuse for laziness or incompetence. Wisdom demands that we sharpen the axe.
That brings a sharp conviction to the way we handle our daily responsibilities.
Right.
I love that point. You cannot spiritualize poor planning.
You really cannot.
If my roof is leaking because I was too lazy to patch the shingles, I cannot blame spiritual warfare for the water in my living room. I just need to sharpen the axe and do the work.
Do the work, yes.
So we have moved from the physical labor of the hands to the verbal labor of the tongue. Verses 12 through 15 and verse 20 zero in on human speech.
This is where it gets really convicting.
And let me suggest that the fool's speech is like a runaway train.
Okay, I like that.
It starts at the top of a hill with a slight downward slope of nonsense, which seems harmless enough. But as it rolls, it accelerates, gathers massive momentum, completely loses its brakes, and eventually violently derails, destroying everything in its path.
Yeah.
It never just stops on its own. How does the text detail this lethal multiplying of words?
The runaway train is a remarkably accurate picture of the trajectory Solomon outlines. He begins by tracing the syntax of speech in the passage.
Okay, what does the syntax show?
The words of a wise man bring favor, translating the Hebrew word shen, which signifies grace, benefit, and structural soundness.
And the fool?
But the fool's lips, the text says, swallow him up. The Hebrew word tibelenu indicates a self-consuming destruction. The fool is eaten alive by his own mouth.
Wow. Eaten alive by his own mouth.
Yes. The progression of the fool's speech starts in foolishness, but ends in what the Hebrew calls holutra. That translates to evil madness.
Evil madness, so it does not stay static.
It accelerates. The specific phrase Solomon uses is yarba debarim, meaning the fool multiplies words.
Multiplies words, meaning he just keeps talking.
Yes, he talks incessantly about a future he cannot possibly know. He attempts to usurp God's omniscience by declaring what tomorrow will bring, acting as though he holds the timeline of the universe in his own hands.
So it is deeply arrogant.
Very arrogant. He talks so much and so loudly that he becomes physically and mentally disoriented.
Really? Disoriented.
Yeah. Solomon uses this brilliant, almost tragic imagery of a man who talks so much he cannot even find the way to the city. He is completely disconnected from reality, lost in a labyrinth of his own verbiage.
That is a terrifying picture. Lost in a labyrinth of words.
It is. Then in verse 20, Solomon delivers a chilling warning about the danger of secret cursing. He tells the reader not to curse the king even in their thought.
Even in their thought. Wow.
The Hebrew concept used here is mada, which refers to the resting place of the mind. It is the innermost private chamber of human consciousness.
Mada.
Right. Solomon uses the imagery of a bird of the air carrying the voice to illustrate a weighty theological reality, which is that God hears absolutely everything. No sin remains truly hidden.
The silent whispers of our bedrooms.
The unspoken contempt in our minds, the internal monologues of bitterness, they are all fully known to the Lord. Our speech, whether public or entirely secret, is a terrifyingly accurate gauge of our spiritual state.
It is incredibly sobering to realize that our private thoughts have a volume level in heaven.
Yeah, that is a sobering thought.
We treat our minds like a soundproof room where we can indulge in any bitter fantasy or arrogant judgment we want. But Solomon shatters that illusion. The mada, the resting place of the mind, is totally exposed.
Totally exposed.
This brings us to a crucial turning point in our discussion. If we treat Ecclesiastes 10 as just an ancient manual for risk management, or a corporate success guide for middle managers, or a self-help seminar on how to win friends and influence people, we miss the main point the authors are making.
We absolutely do.
We see the reality of the flies in the perfume, the blunt axe, and the evil madness of the tongue. But how do the sources bridge these gritty, practical observations by Solomon directly to Jesus without forcing an artificial connection?
That is the big question.
Because it is very easy to read ancient wisdom literature and just slap a Jesus sticker on the end of it. How do the sources avoid that trap and show how this points to a future hope?
Well, the sources insist that we must read this text through a Christological lens, recognizing that Jesus is the literal incarnation of the wisdom of God.
Okay.
The connection is not forced, it is structurally embedded in redemptive history. Solomon, the earthly son of David, was granted massive wisdom, yet he failed through his own agonizing folly. His reign ended in compromise and division.
And Jesus.
Jesus, the greater son of David, succeeded perfectly where Solomon failed. When you look at the life of Jesus in the Gospels, you see a life with zero flies of death in his character.
Zero flies of death. That is beautiful.
There was no hidden corruption, no sudden loss of temper, no capitulation to temptation in the wilderness. His obedience was a perfect, unblemished fragrance to the Father.
How does he fulfill the specific categories in Ecclesiastes 10?
Well, in verse 17, Solomon speaks of the blessing of the king of nobility whose rule is righteous and governed by self-control. Christ is that ultimate king of nobility. He did not rule by childish appetite. He submitted entirely to the will of the Father, even to the point of death.
And what about the speech? The multiplying of words?
When you contrast the fool's speech in verses 12 through 14 with the speech of Christ, the difference is absolute. The fool multiplies idle words ending in madness. Christ's speech was perfectly gracious, perfectly timed, and never excessive.
Yeah. He knew precisely when to speak cutting truth to the Pharisees.
And precisely when to remain entirely silent before Pilate. The authors conclude this analysis by explaining the core mechanism of the gospel. Human beings cannot simply read Ecclesiastes 10, grit their teeth, and try harder to be wise.
Right. We cannot just muscle our way to wisdom.
No. The law exposed in these verses shines a blinding, clinical light on our human laziness, our corrupt speech, and our miscalibrated hearts. This exposure is designed to crush our self-reliance.
It drives us to despair of our own works.
Yes, it drives the sinner to seek the imputation of Christ's perfect righteousness. Christ lived the perfectly wise life we failed to live, and his wisdom and righteousness are credited to all who believe.
That completely changes how we walk away from this text. It moves from a crushing list of behavioral demands to a mirror that points us toward a perfect substitute.
It really does.
We are not just told to stop being fools, we are shown the one who became wisdom for us. I want to bring these weighty theological concepts back down to a personal level for you listening to carry into your day.
That is a great idea.
We talked about the bird of the air from verse 20, the idea that the mata, the resting place of your mind, is fully audible to God. I want you to conjure this specific scenario.
Okay.
If the hidden, silent monologue of your mind was broadcast out loud over a loudspeaker in your living room for a single day, what would it reveal to your family?
Oh, man. That is a heavy question.
Would it show the sharpened acts of diligent preparation, a heart inclined toward grace and careful thought? Or would it broadcast the exhausting, multiplied words of a fool, full of secret contempt, bitterness, and runaway madness?
Yeah, that is something to really sit with.
Before we close, consider the reality of your own hidden realm. Are you allowing a little folly to ferment right now, ignoring the flies of death in the perfumer's oil because no one else can smell it yet? I challenge you to look closely at what your silent broadcast reveals. Let the conviction of that reality drive you away from self-reliance and seek the true, perfect wisdom that only comes from outside yourself.